He walked into the small-town diner, the kind of place where the smell of frying bacon mixed with fresh coffee to create a sense of comfort. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting warm light over the checkered floor. It was quiet, the kind of calm that comes before the lunch rush. He moved slowly, his large frame filling the doorway. But he carried himself with an ease that made him seem approachable, harmless even. He was greeted with friendly nods from the few people scattered at the tables, and a cheerful wave from the waitress behind the counter. He chose a booth near the window, sitting down with a sigh as he loosened his jacket. His stomach rumbled, a reminder that breakfast had been a long time ago. The waitress came over quickly, not just to take his order, but with a smile that suggested she knew him. "The usual?" she asked. He nodded, returning the smile. He liked coming here. The diner had a rhythm that made the world outside seem less chaotic. He ordered his usual coffee, strong and black, and a plate of eggs and toast. He watched the sunlight glint off the cups and plates, savoring the quiet moments before the day fully began. He had no idea that today would be far from ordinary. Outside, a group of men lingered near their parked cars, their leather jackets and rough demeanor marking them as trouble. They had been hanging around the edges of town, looking for someone to provoke, someone to assert their false sense of power over. They spotted him through the window and smirked. Something about his calm, large presence seemed like a challenge to them. They pushed open the diner door, their laughter echoing in the small space. Drawing the attention of everyone inside, he noticed them immediately. His body tensed slightly, but he stayed seated, his eyes calm, steady. He didn't want trouble, not today. He had long ago learned how to read situations, how to measure energy in a room. But he sensed that these men were looking for a confrontation. The waitress, noticing the change in the air, paused near the counter, her smile faltering. The men swaggered to the counter, leaning over to jeer and make comments loud enough for him to hear. Their words were sharp, intended to provoke, to draw a reaction. Patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some trying to pretend they weren't watching, others exchanging uneasy glances. He sipped his coffee slowly, taking in the scene. He didn't want to escalate, but he also wouldn't allow himself to be bullied. One of the men, taller and broader than the others, moved toward his table, his boots scraping the floor with a threatening rhythm. "Hey, big guy," he called, with a sneer that carried far more malice than humor. "You mind if we join you?" He looked up at the man, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm fine here," he replied calmly, voice steady but firm. There was no fear in his tone, just a clear boundary. The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound that didn't belong in the cozy diner. He leaned closer, ignoring the waitress who had stepped between them. Trying to diffuse the tension, the other men crowded around, some standing behind the counter, some lingering near the tables, creating a circle around him. The diner, once a sanctuary of quiet and warmth, now felt like a trap. Every patron felt the tension, the air thick with anticipation. Conversations died down, forks paused midair, and eyes watched every move he made. He kept his hands visible on the table, relaxed but ready, his body language calm yet alert. He remembered years of discipline, of training his mind and body to respond without panic. He had been in situations before, high pressure, dangerous, life and death scenarios, but this was different. This was ordinary life, and he didn't want to bring chaos into it. He wanted to protect himself, not escalate unnecessarily. The taller man slammed a hand on the table, causing cups to rattle. "You think you can just sit here, huh? You think you can ignore us?" He spat, his words venomous, meant to provoke. Some patrons instinctively moved back, while others leaned forward, curious, unable to look away. The waitress tried to intervene again, her voice gentle but firm. "Please, let him enjoy his meal. There's no need for trouble." But the men were in no mood to listen. They circled him, trying to intimidate, trying to break the calm he maintained so effortlessly. He looked around the diner, noting exits, the position of each person, and the way the men moved. His mind worked quickly, silently preparing for whatever might come next. He still hoped it wouldn't come to that. One of the younger men, nervously laughing, reached out and tapped him on the shoulder. He turned, slow and deliberate, meeting the man's gaze with a quiet intensity. "Do I know you?" the man asked, trying to mask fear with arrogance. "You seem out of place." He shook his head slightly, smiling faintly. "Just here for breakfast," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the young man hesitate. There was something in his eyes, a depth, a quiet command that suggested he was not to be trifled with. The young man's confidence wavered for a moment, but the others pushed him forward, egging him on. Trying to maintain dominance, the tension grew. The diner silent, except for the clinking of silverware and the hum of the coffee machine. He took another sip of coffee, slow and deliberate, keeping his composure. Every muscle was ready, every thought precise. He was aware of his size, yes, but more than that, he was aware of his experience, of what he had survived and learned. And he wasn't about to let ignorance and cruelty dictate this moment. The gang members exchanged glances, underestimating him based on appearances. They assumed they had the upper hand, that his size and quiet demeanor were weaknesses. They didn't know the years of training, of discipline, of controlled power that lay beneath the surface. They didn't know that every slight, every challenge, would be met with precision and calm strength. He leaned back slightly in the booth, hands still on the table, eyes following the movements of each man. The waitress hovered nearby, tense but trusting in his ability to handle the situation. Patrons whispered quietly, some reaching for their phones, unsure if they should intervene or stay hidden. The atmosphere was thick, heavy with the anticipation of what might happen next. The taller man, growing impatient, stepped even closer, trying to provoke a reaction. He reached out again, aggressive and uninvited, and that was the moment where patience met reality. He didn't flinch, didn't react with anger. He simply shifted slightly. A subtle movement that revealed strength and readiness. The man recoiled slightly, sensing instinctively that he had misjudged the situation. For a moment, the diner seemed suspended in time. Every breath, every heartbeat felt louder, every eye focused on the unfolding tension. He remained seated, calm and composed, exuding a presence that was both reassuring and commanding. The gang, expecting fear or submission, instead faced an unshakable calm that unsettled them. They realized, perhaps too late, that appearances were deceptive, and in that quiet pause, the diner's atmosphere began to shift. Patrons, once frozen, began to sense the truth in his demeanor. This was a man who had faced far greater challenges, who carried strength in every gesture, discipline in every breath. The gang's bravado wavered, though they didn't yet understand why. They were still loud, still aggressive, but now tinged with uncertainty. The waitress brought over his breakfast, placing the plate gently in front of him, and he nodded in thanks without taking his eyes off the group. He was polite, patient, yet fully aware. The gang members glanced at the eggs and toast, then back at him, trying to regain dominance through words, through presence, through intimidation. But the calmness in his eyes, the quiet strength in his posture, made them hesitate. He began to eat slowly, deliberately, without breaking eye contact. Each bite was measured, each sip of coffee a testament to his patience. He was not afraid. He was prepared. And the diner, once just a backdrop for breakfast, had become the stage for a quiet showdown between calm strength and reckless aggression. Time seemed to stretch, tension palpable. Outside, the sun continued to rise, spilling more light into the diner, illuminating the scene for all who watched. The gang realized that this would not be an ordinary confrontation. They had chosen poorly, and while they didn't yet know it, the man they sought to intimidate carried a past, a history, a skill set that made him far more dangerous than they could imagine. As he continued his meal, he remained calm, polite, and unyielding. The diner seemed to hold its breath along with him. Every patron, every staff member, sensed the quiet power emanating from the large man at the booth. And outside, the gang's bravado began to crack, the first signs of fear appearing in their expressions. They had entered the diner thinking it was a simple act of intimidation. But the quiet, composed man before them was about to prove that they were gravely mistaken. He finished his coffee and eggs slowly, unhurried, maintaining composure, showing no sign of fear, no sign of panic. The gang members, realizing that their usual tactics would not work here, began to murmur among themselves, confusion creeping into their arrogance. He simply sat back, calm and aware, ready for whatever came next, though hoping it wouldn't come to that. In the quiet moments of the diner, with sunlight spilling through the windows and the scent of coffee filling the air, the first act of this story had played out, a calm before the storm. The beginning of an encounter that none inside the diner would soon forget. The tension in the diner had grown thicker with every passing moment. The gang, feeling challenged, began moving closer, their movements loud and deliberate. The taller man's boots scraped the floor, echoing in the quiet space. He looked around, calm and steady, taking in each person, each movement, each potential risk. He did not panic, nor did he make any sudden moves. He had learned long ago that keeping calm was sometimes the strongest form of defense. One of the younger men tried to lean over the table, sneer on his face. "You think you can just sit here and stare at us?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. The man did not flinch. He simply looked at him, slow and deliberate, his gaze steady, unwavering. There was a quiet strength in his eyes, a weight of experience that made the young man hesitate. The waitress hovered nearby, trying to maintain a calm environment. She cleared her throat gently. "Please, there's no need for this. Everyone can enjoy their breakfast." Her voice was calm, but the tension made it sound almost fragile. She glanced at him, silently asking if he needed help. He gave a small, reassuring nod, indicating that he had everything under control. The gang was growing impatient. They had expected fear or submission, and they were not getting either. The taller man slammed his hand on the table again, rattling cups and plates. "You're a big guy, but I bet you're soft too," he said, trying to provoke a reaction. The man at the table remained calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger. Instead, he leaned back slightly, keeping his hands visible and his body relaxed but ready. Other patrons watched with wide eyes. Some whispered to each other, unsure whether to intervene. Some grabbed their phones, ready to call for help if needed. The diner had become a stage. The audience caught in the middle of a confrontation they hadn't expected to witness. The gang members began circling, testing boundaries, looking for a reaction. One of them reached out to grab his arm, thinking that intimidation would work. The man's hand moved subtly, just enough to shift the attacker's balance. The younger man stumbled slightly, surprised by the strength he had underestimated. It was a small move, but it spoke volumes. He continued to eat slowly, deliberately, showing no fear, no anger. Every action was controlled, calculated, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. The gang's bravado started to crack, but they tried to maintain control through words. "You're hiding something, aren't you?" One of them sneered. "You've got that look in your eyes." The man didn't answer immediately. He chewed his food slowly, drank his coffee, and continued observing. He noticed their patterns, their weaknesses, their arrogance. Every movement, every gesture, he cataloged mentally. He didn't want trouble, but if it came, he was prepared to handle it. The tallest member, frustrated by the lack of reaction, tried another tactic. He moved closer to the booth, towering over him, attempting to assert dominance through size alone. The man looked up, calm, his eyes meeting the intruders with an intensity that made the man pause. There was no malice, no aggression in the gaze, only a quiet strength and certainty that made him feel uneasy. One of the gang members, a small but loud man, attempted to provoke with words. "You think you're tough just because you sit there like a statue?" he shouted. The man smiled faintly, a calm, measured expression that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. His presence alone made the gang hesitate, their confidence wavering. The atmosphere in the diner was electric. Patrons shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, others retreating. Forks and spoons were set down, coffee cups held tight. Even the staff seemed frozen in a moment of collective tension. The gang had expected an easy target, but they were met with an unshakable calm that unnerved them. One of the younger men tried a different approach. Moving to block the exit? Where do you think you're going? He asked, attempting to corner him. The man at the table remained seated, relaxed, yet fully aware. He didn't panic. He assessed the situation, noting the angles, the distances, the movements of each person in the diner. He understood the importance of positioning and patience. The taller man, growing more aggressive, slammed his fist on the table once more. "You're going to pay for staring at us," he shouted. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving the taller man. There was a quiet, unspoken warning in his gaze that made the aggressor pause, just slightly unsure if he had misjudged. The waitress tried again, her voice gentle but firm. "Please, just calm down. No one wants any trouble." She glanced at the patrons, silently pleading for someone to step in, but everyone was frozen. Captivated by the scene unfolding, the man's calmness was deliberate. He didn't need to act aggressively to assert control. His presence, his posture, his steady gaze communicated that he was not someone to underestimate. The gang could sense it, even if they didn't fully understand why. Their confidence, once so loud and boisterous, was starting to waver. He took another bite of his food, slow and deliberate, as if time had stretched. Each movement was intentional, each gesture measured. The gang tried to maintain dominance through words and presence. But the quiet, controlled strength before them made their attempts seem foolish. They were beginning to realize that this man was far from ordinary. The atmosphere in the diner shifted subtly. The patrons, once tense and silent, began to sense that the situation was not as simple as it seemed. Some whispered to each other, some continued to watch in awe. The staff, still cautious, began to relax slightly. Trusting in the quiet authority emanating from the man at the table, the gang members, frustrated by their lack of progress, started to exchange nervous glances. Their arrogance was being challenged, their expectation of fear unmet. One of them muttered under his breath, unsure if he should continue. The taller man, still trying to assert dominance, leaned closer. But even he felt a twinge of uncertainty. The man at the table remained calm, composed, unshaken. He continued his meal, sipping coffee, chewing slowly, all while observing every movement around him. He was aware of the gang's intentions, aware of their weaknesses, and fully prepared to act if necessary. But he also hoped it wouldn't come to that. He wanted to de-escalate, to protect himself without unnecessary violence. The younger man who had initially tried to provoke him shifted nervously. He glanced at the others, unsure how to proceed. Their usual tactics, their loud words and aggressive posturing, were not working. They were confronting a man whose presence alone demanded respect, whose calm strength made them hesitate. Time seemed to stretch. Each second was filled with tension, with anticipation. The diner, once a quiet place of comfort and routine, had become a battleground of patience, strength, and discipline. Patrons watched in silence, captivated by the unfolding confrontation. The staff, too, remained close, ready to help if needed, but also trusting in the man's ability to handle the situation. The tallest man finally spoke again, his voice a mix of frustration and uncertainty. "You think you can just sit there and ignore us?" he demanded. The man didn't answer immediately. He finished his bite of food, drank his coffee, and then looked up, calm and steady. There was no fear, no anger, only a quiet, commanding presence that made the taller man pause. The gang, sensing that they were losing control, tried one last time to provoke a reaction. They leaned closer, shouted louder, attempted to intimidate with presence alone. But the man remained calm, seated, composed, his eyes meeting each one with steady certainty. He had faced challenges far greater than this, and it showed in every controlled movement, every measured breath. The waitress, seeing the tension reaching its peak, gently placed a fresh coffee cup on the table nearby. "Here, sir, on the house," she said, her voice calm but carrying a hint of relief. He nodded in thanks, appreciating the gesture. But still fully aware of the situation around him, the gang members were beginning to realize that this was not a man to be trifled with. Their confidence, once so loud and brash, was cracking under the weight of his quiet authority. They exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of their next move. Sensing that their arrogance had met its match, he continued his meal. Calm and deliberate, showing no signs of fear or panic. The diner seemed to hold its breath along with him. Every patron, every staff member felt the tension, felt the quiet strength emanating from the large man at the booth. And while the gang had not yet understood the full extent of his experience, they were beginning to sense that they had made a grave mistake as he finished the last sip of his coffee. He remained seated, relaxed, but ready, aware of every movement around him. The gang, frustrated and uncertain, began to back away slightly, realizing that their usual tactics would not work here. The quiet, controlled presence before them was far more powerful than they had anticipated. The diner returned slowly to a semblance of normalcy, though the air remained thick with tension. Patrons resumed eating cautiously. Staff relaxed, but still watchful. And the gang hesitated, unsure whether to leave or push further. The man at the table remained calm, his demeanor a quiet reminder that strength often lay in patience, in control, and in knowing when and how to act. In that moment, the first cracks in the gang's confidence became evident. They had expected fear, weakness, or submission, and instead found a man whose calm authority unsettled them. The diner, once a place of routine, had become the stage for a subtle but powerful confrontation, one that would be remembered by everyone present. And as he sat there, finishing his meal, it was clear that he was ready for whatever came next. Though he still hoped it would not come to that, the tension in the diner had reached a point where silence weighed heavily over everyone. The gang had been circling, trying to find a weakness, trying to provoke any sign of fear. But the man at the table remained calm, composed, unshaken. Every movement he made was deliberate. He took a slow sip of his coffee, chewed his food carefully, and let his eyes scan the diner. It was clear he was aware of everything: the position of the gang members, the exits, the nearby patrons, and even the subtle signs of tension in each person's body. The tallest gang member slammed his hand on the table again, rattling the cups and silverware. "Stop staring at us," he shouted, trying to assert dominance. But the man didn't flinch. He looked up slowly, his gaze meeting the tall man's, steady and unyielding. There was no anger, no fear, just a calm that unnerved everyone watching. The man's presence alone made the gang pause just slightly. Unsure if they had miscalculated, the youngest member of the gang tried to laugh it off, moving closer and mocking him. "You think you're tough, huh? Sitting there like some kind of statue?" he said, but his voice faltered when he noticed the calm in the man's eyes. The gang had expected fear or hesitation, something to push against. Instead, they were met with quiet strength that threw them off balance. The man slowly set down his fork and placed both hands on the table, keeping them visible. His large frame gave him an imposing presence, but there was no threat in his movements. Every subtle shift of his body exuded control. He wasn't aggressive, but he made it clear that he was not someone to underestimate. The gang members exchanged uncertain glances, their bravado beginning to crumble. One of the men tried to lean over the table, attempting to intimidate him physically. "What are you going to do?" he sneered. The man's response was quiet but firm, a calm that carried weight far beyond his words. "I suggest you step back now." His tone was neutral, almost polite, but it held an authority that was unmistakable. The gang's laughter faltered. They had underestimated him. It was becoming painfully clear. The waitress moved slightly closer, trying to mediate without escalating the situation. "Please, there's no need for this," she said softly. Her eyes flicked to the man at the table, looking for reassurance. He gave a small nod, indicating that he had everything under control. His calmness was contagious. Slowly seeping into the atmosphere of the diner, the tallest gang member's face reddened with frustration. He slammed his fist on the table again. "You're hiding something? We can see it in your eyes," he shouted, trying to regain control. The man didn't react aggressively. Instead, he leaned back slightly, a faint smile on his lips. It was not a smile of amusement, but of quiet certainty. A subtle signal that he was fully aware of what was happening and that he had no intention of being provoked. The younger gang members started shifting uneasily. Sensing the change in the energy of the room, their attempts to intimidate were failing, and they were beginning to realize that they had misjudged this man. He was not just calm, he was controlled, disciplined, and aware. Every move he made was deliberate, every gesture measured. He was calculating, and the gang could feel it. One of them, trying to salvage some semblance of authority, moved to block the man's path to the exit. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, trying to corner him. The man didn't panic. He continued to eat slowly, still observing, still calculating. He wasn't afraid. He had faced challenges far greater than this. Challenges that had required every ounce of his skill, discipline, and focus. Suddenly, the air shifted. The man's body tensed ever so slightly, a subtle movement that caught the attention of the gang. It was the kind of readiness that comes from years of training, a silent signal that he was prepared to act if necessary. The gang members felt it, even if they couldn't identify it. Their confidence wavered. The tallest member leaned in closer, trying to provoke a reaction. "You think you can just sit there and stare at us?" he demanded. The man looked up, slow and deliberate, his gaze meeting the aggressors. There was no fear, no panic, only a quiet intensity that made the man hesitate. He had expected submission or aggression, but what he saw instead unsettled him. The youngest gang member attempted a mocking laugh, but it sounded forced. He could feel the uncertainty growing among his companions. Their usual tactics, intimidation, loud words, physical presence were not working. They were confronting a man whose calm authority was more powerful than their aggression. They had made a grave miscalculation. The man at the table placed his hands firmly on the table, his posture relaxed yet ready. Every muscle was alert, every sense tuned to the movements around him. He had faced danger before, real danger, and he had learned that control and patience were often more effective than aggression. He didn't want trouble, but he would not allow himself to be bullied. One of the gang members tried a final push, reaching for him aggressively. In a sudden fluid movement, the man shifted, redirecting the force without even standing. The young man stumbled slightly, surprised by the strength and precision he had underestimated. The diner fell silent. Patrons held their breath, witnessing a moment that was both tense and extraordinary. The man's eyes met each of the gang members in turn, calm and unyielding. He spoke softly, but clearly. "Leave now, and don't come back. You've misjudged this situation completely." His voice carried authority without aggression, and it was enough. The gang, realizing they were completely outmatched, began to step back, their bravado gone, replaced by a mixture of fear and disbelief. The tallest member, still angry but now cautious, muttered under his breath. The other members exchanged glances, the reality sinking in that they had underestimated him. They had entered the diner expecting fear and submission, and instead found a man whose presence alone commanded respect. Without another word, they began to retreat. Their earlier arrogance replaced with uncertainty. The man returned his attention to his meal, calm and composed. He sipped his coffee, still observing, ensuring that the gang was leaving without further incident. The patrons and staff exhaled collectively, the tension finally beginning to ease. The diner slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, the atmosphere heavy but relieved. The waitress came over, setting down another cup of coffee. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. He nodded, a faint smile of reassurance on his face. "I'm fine," he said simply. His calm demeanor had been enough to prevent chaos. Enough to maintain order without escalating the situation further. The patrons resumed their meals cautiously, casting occasional glances toward the gang as they left. The sense of normalcy slowly returned, but the impression of what had just happened lingered in the air. Everyone in the diner had witnessed something remarkable, not a violent confrontation, but a display of controlled strength and quiet authority that had diffused a potentially dangerous situation as the gang disappeared from sight. The man continued to eat, unhurried, composed. He remained aware of his surroundings, always prepared, always calm. His presence alone had shifted the energy in the diner, demonstrating that true strength is often measured not by aggression, but but by control, patience, and discipline. In that moment, it became clear that this man was no ordinary diner patron. His calmness, his precision, his ability to neutralize the threat without escalating it all hinted at a past filled with discipline and experience. The patrons and staff exchanged quiet whispers, realizing that they had just witnessed someone whose presence and skill went far beyond appearances. The diner, once a place of routine and comfort, had been transformed into a stage for a subtle but powerful confrontation. The quiet authority of the man at the table had not only diffused a dangerous situation, but had left a lasting impression on everyone present. And as he finished his meal, calm and composed, it was evident that he carried a past, a history, and a skill set that made him far more capable than anyone had assumed. He paid his bill, nodding politely to the staff, and stood to leave. The patrons watched in silence as he moved toward the door, his presence still commanding, still calm. The gang had fled, their arrogance shattered, and the diner had returned to its quiet rhythm. But the memory of the encounter, the realization of the man's true strength, lingered in the minds of all who had witnessed it. Outside, the sun continued to rise, casting light over the small town. The man walked steadily, composed, unhurried. He had faced the confrontation without fear, without aggression, and had emerged unscathed, his calm authority intact. The story of what had happened in that diner would spread quietly, a testament to the power of discipline, patience, and controlled strength. And for the man, it was just another morning, another meal, another test met with quiet confidence and skill. The diner was quiet again, but the calm was fragile, like a stretched rope that could snap at any moment. The gang had retreated for a moment, muttering among themselves, but their frustration and disbelief were obvious. They had thought intimidation would work, that fear could be provoked with words and presence. Instead, they had been met with unshakable calm, discipline, and quiet strength. The man at the table, large and imposing, had revealed nothing yet, and that was precisely why they were unsettled. They had underestimated him, and it was clear now that he was more than just a man enjoying breakfast. The tallest gang member stepped back, pacing near the door as if weighing his options. His hands clenched into fists, then relaxed, then clenched again. The others followed, whispering and casting nervous glances at the man seated calmly at the booth. They could not read him, could not gauge his next move. Every instinct they had about intimidation and aggression was failing. The realization hit them that this man was dangerous, but in a way they could not define. The man finished the last bite of his toast, setting the plate down slowly, deliberately. He sipped his coffee, unhurried, calm, but with every fiber of his being, alert and aware. His eyes scanned the diner, noting exits, positions, distances, and subtle cues from the gang. He had a lifetime of experience in situations like this, high pressure, tense, unpredictable. He knew the importance of patience, observation, and timing. He did not need to escalate unnecessarily. He could control the outcome without chaos. One of the younger members of the gang stepped forward again, trying to assert a false sense of authority. "You think you're some kind of tough guy?" he said, voice slightly shaky. The man looked up slowly, meeting the young man's gaze with calm intensity. It was a look that carried weight and experience, a quiet warning that spoke louder than words. The young man faltered, uncertainty creeping into his expression. He could feel the difference between a man who relied on aggression and a man who had mastered control. The tallest man took a step closer, still trying to maintain dominance. "We don't take kindly to people staring at us," he said, his voice tense. The man at the table did not flinch. He set down his coffee and spoke softly, evenly, "Step back. You are making a mistake." There was no anger in his tone, only calm authority. His words were simple, yet the power behind them was unmistakable. The gang members glanced at one another, their confidence beginning to crumble. They had expected a reaction driven by fear or anger, something they could manipulate. Instead, they were facing a man who was fully in control of himself and the situation. Every movement he made, every word he spoke, projected a presence that could not be ignored. He did not threaten. He did not provoke. The gang could sense that any misstep on their part could be met with precision and force beyond their imagining. The man slowly rose from the booth, a deliberate and controlled motion that filled the diner with quiet authority. Patrons held their breath as he stood, his size and calm demeanor now even more commanding. He did not rush. He did not gesture violently. Instead, he positioned himself so that he could move if necessary, his body language conveying readiness and restraint simultaneously. The gang hesitated, unsure how to respond. They had not anticipated this level of composure and skill. The youngest member tried to push forward again, attempting to intimidate physically. In a fluid, controlled motion, the man shifted, redirecting the movement without even raising his voice. The young man stumbled slightly, surprised by the unexpected strength and precision. The other gang members watched, their arrogance beginning to dissolve into doubt and fear. They realized that they were confronting a man who had been trained, a man whose calm was a shield and whose strength was disciplined and controlled. The man's gaze moved over the group, calm but intense. He did not raise his voice. He did not make sudden movements. His presence alone was enough to command attention and respect. He spoke slowly, deliberately. "I suggest you leave now. This ends here." The tone was neutral, polite even, but there was an unmistakable authority that conveyed the seriousness of his words. The gang froze, uncertainty replacing their previous aggression. One of the taller men laughed nervously, trying to mask fear with bravado. Or what? He sneered, but his voice lacked conviction. The calm intensity of the man at the table made it clear that he did not need to escalate with violence to assert control. His training, his experience, and his awareness were enough to neutralize the situation. The gang members could feel it instinctively. Even if they didn't fully understand why, the man stepped slightly closer. Maintaining eye contact, his posture relaxed, but ready. "Leave now," he repeated, voice calm and steady. "Do not return. You've misjudged the situation completely." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was undeniable. The gang members exchanged uneasy glances, the first real cracks in their confidence appearing. They had underestimated him, and now they knew it. The atmosphere in the diner was electric. Patrons watched in silent awe as the gang struggled to regain composure. The staff moved cautiously, ready to help if needed, but trusting in the man's ability to handle the situation. Every subtle movement, every word conveyed mastery and control. The gang could sense it. Their usual tactics, their loud voices and physical posturing, were ineffective. Against a man who had complete command over himself and the environment, the tallest gang member took a step back, reassessing. His hands were clenched, his jaw tight. He had expected submission or fear, and instead had encountered calm authority. His companions looked at him, uncertain, and he realized they were outmatched. The man's presence alone was enough to command respect and caution. The gang's arrogance faltered, replaced with unease and growing fear. The man continued to observe, his movements deliberate and measured. He did not raise his voice, did not threaten, but every subtle gesture spoke volumes. His posture, his calm breathing, the way he held his hands all conveyed readiness and control. The gang understood finally that they had misjudged him entirely. Their intimidation had failed, and they were powerless against his composed strength. One of the younger gang members muttered something under his breath, and the man's eyes flicked toward him, calm and unyielding. The silent authority in that gaze was enough to make him stop, to make him reconsider any further provocation. The diner seemed suspended in time, the tension palpable but controlled. Every person in the room felt the shift, the realization that this was a man whose presence alone demanded respect. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the gang began to back away. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced by fear and uncertainty. The tallest man glanced at the others, then at the man, and finally nodded in silent agreement. They would leave. There would be no further confrontation. They had underestimated him, and they would not make that mistake again. The man remained still, calm and composed, watching them retreat. There was no gloating, no aggression, just quiet authority and measured control. Patrons exhaled collectively, the tension lifting like a heavy weight. The staff relaxed, moving about the diner once again, but still watching cautiously. The man returned to his booth, sitting down slowly, resuming his meal as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. His calmness had been enough to prevent chaos, to maintain order without violence. And to assert his authority with dignity, the diner returned to its quiet rhythm. But the impression of what had just occurred lingered. Everyone who had witnessed it understood that they had seen more than a simple confrontation. They had seen discipline, awareness, and controlled strength in action. The man's calm authority had neutralized a potentially dangerous situation without raising a hand unnecessarily. It was a lesson in quiet power and respect. As he finished his coffee and placed the cup down, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He had handled the situation exactly as he had intended. He had not needed to escalate, had not needed to raise his voice, had not needed to resort to unnecessary aggression. His presence alone, his discipline, and his controlled movements had been enough to ensure the safety of everyone in the diner, including himself. The gang had left, humiliated and defeated without a single physical confrontation. The patrons and staff returned to their routines, though whispers of what had happened filled the air. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a man whose calm and controlled strength had diffused a dangerous situation with quiet authority and precision. The memory of the encounter would linger in their minds for a long time. He paid his bill, nodded politely to the staff, and stood to leave. His movements were deliberate and calm, his large frame commanding respect without a word. Patrons watched silently as he walked toward the door, the sun casting light over his path. Outside, the town continued its morning rhythm, unaware of the extraordinary events that had just transpired in the small diner. As he stepped outside, he adjusted his jacket and took a deep breath. The calm authority he had maintained inside the diner followed him, a testament to years of discipline and training. He had faced the confrontation with precision and control, neutralizing a threat without unnecessary chaos. The gang's arrogance had met its match, and the quiet, composed man had emerged unshaken, his presence leaving a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed it. The story of what had happened would spread quietly through the town, a tale of calm, strength, discipline, and authority. Everyone who had been in the diner would remember it not as a violent encounter, but as a demonstration of controlled power, the kind that does not need aggression to command respect. And for the man, it was simply another morning, another challenge met with patience, awareness, and quiet skill. The diner had slowly returned to a quiet, ordinary rhythm, but the memory of the confrontation lingered in the air. Patrons whispered quietly, exchanging glances, recounting the moments when the man had remained calm while the gang fumed and hesitated. The staff moved with a sense of relief, though a few still stole glances toward the door, as if expecting trouble to return. But the man at the table had already paid his bill and was preparing to leave. His demeanor calm and unhurried, he stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind him. And the morning sunlight bathed the small street in a warm glow. The air smelled of fresh coffee from the diner and faint exhaust from passing cars. He walked steadily, his large frame commanding a quiet presence, his movements smooth and deliberate. The townspeople on the street could not help but notice him as he passed. Something about the way he carried himself drew attention not through loud gestures, but through calm assurance as he moved down the sidewalk. A few of the patrons followed from the diner, curious and still a little awestruck. Whispers spread quickly. "Did you see that?" One woman murmured. "He didn't even flinch. I've never seen anything like it." Another nodded. "He's not just big. There's something about him. He's trained, disciplined." The man didn't respond to the whispers. He didn't need to. His actions had spoken louder than words. Across the street, a small group of the gang members lingered, nursing their bruised egos and shaken confidence. They had underestimated him completely. Their usual tactics of intimidation had failed, and the calm authority he exuded had left them unsure of themselves. Their loud voices, their bravado, All of it had crumbled under his quiet presence. They had learned a hard lesson that day. Appearances could be deceiving, and strength was not always measured in aggression. Back inside the diner, the staff and patrons slowly resumed their activities, though the energy was different now. People seemed more aware, more cautious, and yet there was a sense of admiration. The man's presence had shifted the atmosphere, and even without trying, he had become an example of quiet authority and controlled power. The waitress tidied the counter and smiled faintly as she thought about how easily he had handled the situation. She had served many people over the years, but few had commanded respect without speaking loudly or making threats. Meanwhile, the man walked to a nearby park. Settling on a bench where he could observe the street and the small town's morning life, he sipped from a travel mug of coffee he had brought along, the steam curling into the crisp air. His large frame hunched slightly as he leaned back, but his eyes remained alert, scanning the environment even as he appeared relaxed. He had faced confrontation before, real danger, and he knew the importance of remaining calm, of staying aware. But he also valued moments like this, when he could blend into ordinary life while still carrying the discipline and strength he had honed over years. A few townspeople approached cautiously, curiosity overcoming their hesitation. One man, an older shopkeeper, spoke first. "I don't mean to intrude, but I saw what happened in the diner." "You've handled that very well," the man nodded politely. "I just stayed calm. That's often enough." The shopkeeper studied him closely. Calm. It was more than calm. You had control, discipline. I've never seen anything like it. The man allowed a faint smile, but said nothing. Words were unnecessary. His actions had already left an impression, and he was content to let that speak for him. Children played in the nearby grass, unaware of the tension that had occurred earlier. The man watched them briefly, his expression softening. Despite his size and presence, there was gentleness in him, a balance between strength and understanding. He had learned that real power was not about showing force, but about controlling oneself, protecting others, and knowing when to act. He had exercised that power that morning, and now he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Meanwhile, word of the diner incident had begun to spread through the town. People talked in shops, at the post office, and in the small library. Everyone described the man in the same way: calm, composed, disciplined, commanding respect without aggression. The story became less about the gang and more about the man who had confronted them with quiet authority. Even those who had not witnessed the event firsthand heard about it. And curiosity and admiration grew as the morning turned into early afternoon. The man continued his quiet walk through town. He stopped occasionally, greeting familiar faces with a nod or brief smile. People sensed his presence, but he did not seek attention. His strength and discipline were natural, not performative. He moved through life the way he had handled the diner controlled, aware and composed. The gang now regrouped at the edge of town, whispered among themselves. They knew they had been humbled, that their usual tactics were ineffective. They would not return to confront him, at least not without careful planning, because the man had revealed capabilities they could not ignore. Their arrogance had been replaced with respect, and perhaps even a lingering fear. The lesson was clear: strength was not always visible. Underestimating someone based on appearance could have consequences. Back at the diner, the staff discussed what had happened. One of the regular patrons said, "I think he's a Marine or something. No one moves like that unless they've been trained." The waitress nodded. "Whatever he is, he reminded us all that calm and control matter more than aggression." That was incredible. Patrons agreed, feeling both relief and admiration. The diner had returned to routine, but everyone present had been affected, reminded of the power of restraint, awareness, and quiet strength. The man continued his day, walking through the town's streets, observing life, and occasionally offering a nod or smile to those who acknowledged him. He did not boast. He did not seek recognition. His satisfaction came from knowing that he had maintained order, protected those around him, and handled the confrontation with precision and discipline. His presence alone had ensured safety and respect, As evening approached, he returned home, a modest house on the outskirts of town. He set down his coat, made himself a simple dinner, and reflected on the day. He had faced tension, potential conflict, and intimidation, but had navigated it with skill and composure. He had not needed to escalate, had not resorted to unnecessary force, and yet had emerged in full control. It was a quiet victory, one that mattered not for recognition but for principle and self-respect. Word of his calm handling of the gang continued to ripple through the town. People told friends, shared the story, and praised his composure. They spoke less of the gang and more of the man who had neutralized a dangerous situation without raising his voice. Even those who had not witnessed it firsthand felt the impact, understanding the value of calm authority, awareness, and controlled strength. Later, as night fell, the man sat in his living room. Reflecting on the day's events, he thought about the diner, the tension, the gang, and the patrons who had watched silently. He considered the lesson that his actions had taught, not just to the gang, but to the town, that true strength lies in control, patience, and discipline. One does not need to be aggressive to command respect. One only needs to be aware, composed, and prepared in the days that followed. The town carried a quiet sense of admiration and respect. The man's reputation spread not as a figure of intimidation, but as a symbol of disciplined strength and calm authority. Patrons returned to the diner, staff smiled knowingly, and the story of the confrontation became part of the town's shared experience. Everyone who had witnessed it or heard about it carried a reminder of the power of composure and the importance of respect. The gang never returned, their arrogance tempered by the quiet authority they had encountered. They spoke cautiously of the encounter, aware that they had underestimated someone whose strength was not loud or visible, but disciplined and controlled. The lesson was clear. Appearances can be deceiving, and true power often lies in patience, awareness, and restraint. For the man, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. He continued his routines, walked the streets of the town, and interacted with people naturally and kindly. He did not seek attention or praise. His satisfaction came from the knowledge that he had handled the situation properly, protected others, and demonstrated that calm. Controlled strength is more effective than aggression. The diner continued to operate, filled with patrons who now carried a quiet awareness of the events that had unfolded. The story of the confrontation became part of the town's memory, told quietly with admiration and respect. People learned that strength is not always visible. Composure can command respect, and that patience and discipline often matter more than aggression. As the town settled into evening, the man reflected on the day's lessons. He had faced potential danger and handled it with care, calm, and precision. He had protected those around him without unnecessary escalation, demonstrating the power of discipline and self-control. His actions left an indelible mark on the town, a story that would be remembered and shared, not for violence or aggression, but for quiet strength and authority. The night grew quiet, the streets calm, and the diner empty. The town had witnessed an extraordinary example of composure, discipline, and controlled strength. And for the man, it was simply another day, another test met with patience, awareness, and quiet skill, leaving a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed it.